The year of the Linux desktop. Sometimes I get asked, when is Linux going to take over? When is it going to become the dominant operating system on laptops and desktops? Unfortunately, it's just not going to happen. Hello and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. And today I'm finally going to do a video about the year of the Linux desktop. And this is such a cliche at this point that I actually avoided this up until now because, everyone else is covering this, so why should I even bother? But recently I started thinking and I decided to do this video after all. Reason being, I've actually been using Linux on laptops and desktops for over 20 years, so not only do I have opinions on this matter, I have a lot of experience when it comes to this subject matter as well, so I figured I may as well make a video about this and give you guys my thoughts in the hopes that it might be interesting to you to hear my thoughts from somebody who's been using Linux for quite a while. So what I'm going to do in today's video is give you guys my thoughts on this subject, which is going to include my interpretation of what the year of the Linux desktop phrase means in the first place, why it's important to so many people, and also why I think it's just not going to happen, but that's okay. I'm actually going to argue that it's perfectly fine that Linux is not going to take over the desktop, and there's nothing wrong with that, and Linux is in no danger. So, you know what? We should actually be okay with the fact that the year of the Linux desktop isn't going to happen, because it's not really as big of a deal as everybody makes it out to be. Now, before I get into all that, I just want to mention real quick that I recently had a chance to sit down and watch a movie. The movie was called Everything Everywhere All at Once, and it's by far the strangest movie that I've ever seen in my entire life. Okay, what does that have to do with Linux, and why did I mention a movie that I've seen recently when I'm talking about the year of the Linux desktop? Well, actually, as human beings, we really enjoy telling other people about something that resonates with us. I don't care if it's your favorite sports team, maybe your favorite band, your favorite movie in my example, maybe your favorite television show. As human beings, we build rapport with one another by letting people know what we're into in hopes that maybe they're into the same thing as us, and then we'll have something in common, and maybe through that we can build a friendship or just have some kind of a community around something that we like. So we'll recommend other people to see movies that we've enjoyed, watch TV shows, and so on. And what that has to do with Linux is that Linux isn't really any different when it comes to that. If we like Linux and we're passionate about it, then we want to tell the world about it. So you could say that by having a YouTube channel, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm building a community, I'm building rapport, and I'm letting you guys know about something that I enjoy. That's why this channel exists, because I love Linux, so I want to tell you guys about it. But getting back to the year of the Linux desktop, I feel like it's the same thing as telling people about something that you're enjoying, but on a whole different level. Think about it. When your favorite sports team wins the playoffs, that really resonates with you. You feel good about that because that sports team that you've been following made it all the way and won everything. That has got to be like one of the most affirming feelings because it validates what you like to see something you enjoy become the most popular thing. And likewise, when your favorite movie just takes over the box office and becomes number one, then that's just really validating and it feels really good. So I feel like as people that are passionate about Linux, we also want that same thing, but there's no playoffs here and there's no box office. There's the desktop. If Linux takes over the desktop, then that's so awesome because our chosen operating system, our chosen platform has become number one. And that'll feel great, won't it? Just think about how awesome that would actually be. And that brings me right to how I interpret the phrase year of the Linux desktop. It refers to when Linux takes over everything. It becomes the dominant operating system that obliterates everything else. And there's no competition because Linux is that much greater and is found on the majority of computers that you could buy in stores. And the thing is, when it comes to us as passionate Linux people, we just want to see Linux succeed. But the actual reality is far different. The reality is that Linux doesn't give a if it succeeds on the desktop or not. Linux couldn't possibly care less. And the reason for that is because Linux exists where it naturally exists and where it fits in the most. And, year of the Linux desktop implies that Linux is doing so badly that, It's barely even a blip on the radar and nobody even knows about it. And none of that is true at all. Linux is actually the dominant operating system on the earth right now. It is absolutely the dominant operating system. That's already happened. It happened a long time ago. And the thing is, it may not be the dominant operating system on desktops and laptops, but it absolutely is the dominant OS on servers, IoT, and many devices out there. There's more installations of Linux than you could possibly imagine, and the sheer magnitude of the number of installations in regards to Linux is so huge that if it didn't exist, then a good majority of the internet would be completely different. So Linux has an absolutely massive footprint, but just not a massive footprint when it comes to laptops and desktops. That is dominated by Windows, obviously, and also Mac OS. But wouldn't it be great, though, if Linux actually did dominate everything? If the year of the Linux desktop actually legitimately happened, wouldn't that be so cool? I mean, just think about it. You go to any store and Linux is the only platform, the only OS that's actually sold on any of the computers that you'll buy at the store. I mean, at that point, what's the point of Apple actually being in business anymore when that happens? Because nobody's going to buy a MacBook after the year of the Linux desktop. So Apple is just going to have to shut down Mac OS and MacBooks because they can't sell any of them because Linux just dominates that much. So then Apple has to lay a bunch of people off, maybe even just let people go outright. A lot of people lose their job. And then Microsoft has to shut down the department that manages Windows and let all of those people go. So they're out of a job. And now that doesn't exist. And now Linux is the only option that you can get on laptops and desktops, which means we don't really have a choice of platform anymore. We only have that one thing. The more I really kind of work this out, the less of a good thing it sounds. I mean, do we really want one dominant platform? It's bad enough that Windows dominates as much as it does, but I don't want Windows to not exist on laptops and desktops. I don't want Mac OS to cease to exist either, because the way I see it, you as the consumer, you have three choices: Linux, Mac OS, or Windows. And that's awesome. I mean, I wouldn't want that to be any other way, right? I like the fact that we have choice, and I really don't want to see one platform dominate more than the other. In fact, if I was to change the situation into anything that, I could make it, then my decision would be to have Linux, Windows, and Mac OS to be exactly equal when it comes to market share, to the point where, you just make the choice as far as which one you personally like the best, and that's all there is to it. I think that's the best scenario that we could hope for. And maybe you define year of the Linux desktop to be, when that happens to where Linux is an equal choice between the other two platforms. But, considering things are the way they are, I really don't see that being completely even between the three platforms. I don't think that'll ever happen. So that version of the year of the Linux desktop, I don't think is going to happen. So should we be concerned then that Linux on desktops and laptops is barely a blip on the radar? I mean, is that a problem? Well, no. Actually, a lower percentage of users when it comes to desktop and laptops for Linux distributions is not a problem at all. Now, of course, market share is all about how you interpret the numbers. When I tell you guys that currently, as of the time I'm recording this video, most of the market share websites actually estimate Linux to have just north of 2.5% of desktop and laptop installs out there, that sounds minuscule, right? I mean, that's just nothing. That's teensy. But actually, it depends on how you think about it, because hundreds of millions of computers are in use today, at least. I don't have the exact number personally, and every website I check has different numbers, so it's really hard to give you guys an exact number here. But the fact is, 2.5% of hundreds of millions of computers is a pretty big install base, but also when you consider that the average person has a smartphone, and many of those run a Linux kernel as well, I mean, think of Android, for example, then the numbers when it comes to Linux adoption just skyrockets at that point. But for some reason, we're fixated on laptops and desktops, and I really don't understand why. I mean, Linux is extremely successful and one of the most successful technologies ever. I mean, the majority of all the most popular websites out there run on Linux. Linux has the majority of servers, like I mentioned, and it dominates several markets. So we need to really stop saying that it's lagging behind, that it's a failure, because that's absolutely not true. And we need to really kind of stop focusing on laptops and desktops so much because we're really missing the big picture when we do that. Now, of course, a really good question to ask at this point is, why hasn't Linux taken over the laptop and desktop market? What's stopping it? If it's so great, then, well, why is it only 2.5%? What's up with that? Now, I bet you guys are probably wanting an in-depth analysis from me personally on why Linux hasn't taken over. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the answer is extremely simple and extremely easy. I mean, it actually annoys me that we see all these blog posts out there, top 10 reasons why Linux hasn't taken over the desktop, and they go into this deep dive analysis of why this is the case. But the answer is so much more simple than what they make it out to be. And that answer is people hate change. That's it. Done. No analysis, no top 10 list. I mean, I know that might disappoint some of you guys out there, but that is the reason why Linux hasn't taken over the desktop. Microsoft Windows, it got there first. Windows 95, it actually transformed computing. And even though Windows 3.1 and other versions of Windows existed before that, Windows 95 hit mainstream first, and it's what everybody flocked to. And yeah, I know, Apple, you could consider they hit mainstream before that, but I'm not really trying to get into that side of things. The point is, Windows became the dominant operating system first. And because people hate change, the majority of people loathe change, as a matter of fact. They're not interested in trying a different desktop at all. They're not interested in trying a different operating system because they don't want to try anything new at all in any category, because generally speaking, we as humans, the majority of us, we prefer the status quo. We're happier when things don't change. So it's not a technical reason why Linux hasn't taken over. And there's all kinds of people out there that'll say, well, Linux isn't as user-friendly and all these other things. That's not true. Linux is absolutely user-friendly. The only reason why people think it's not is because it's not what they learned. I mean, seriously, that's really all there is to it. If you started with Linux, it would be exactly as easy to you as Windows is to other people that use Windows as their daily driver. There's no truth about Linux being harder. It's absolutely not. And there's other comments and myths that I won't bust in this particular video. But the point is, again, people prefer the status quo. They hate change. And as long as we as humans hate change, Linux has no chance of taking over the desktop. It's just not going to happen. And that's, unfortunately, the truth. Okay, so at this point, you understand that my opinion is that the year of the Linux desktop is never going to happen because people hate change. I mean, yeah, it is as simple as that. But there are some additional points to consider here. Earlier, I mentioned that Linux doesn't give a if it succeeds or not. So what did I mean by that? Let's just say we had only 1,000 Linux users on the desktop in the world. Now that is a small number, just 1,000 computers of all the ones sold. Now, of course, that's a completely untrue number, and I just made that up. And I made that up to prove my point that those 1,000 people are happy using it. It resonates with them. They enjoy the Linux desktop. And in their world, they're fine. They're not losing any sleep over the fact that their favorite operating system isn't number one. They're just happily enjoying it. Even when I first started, I didn't care that Linux wasn't number one. I just liked using it for some reason, and I kept using it. That's really all there was to it. So the number of installs on desktops and laptops never factored in to me, and it shouldn't factor into you either. And this is why I really don't like the year of the Linux desktop argument or mindset, if you will. I think it needs to die and never be spoken of again, because it can't possibly be less relevant and less important than it actually is. Because if everyone's opinion of whether or not they should use something comes down to how many other people are also using that thing, like, are they not able to come up with their own opinion? What's the problem here? I don't understand that. I mean, we have live distributions that let you demo Linux live to test it out. So it really doesn't matter what other people think. It matters what you think. That's all that matters, is what you think, what your chosen operating system is, what platform resonates the most with you in particular, and that's the one that you should go with. Now, earlier, I mentioned the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, and I used that as an example of passion. I enjoyed that movie personally. It's definitely not for everyone. You might hate it. I'm just going to throw that out there. But a lot of people liked it. It was reviewed very highly. I mean, look at the reviews for yourself. That movie did very well. However, it didn't make number one at the box office. So how do you interpret that? Do you say that movie was a failure because it didn't dominate the box office? Or do you see it as a success because it was reviewed very highly? What's your metric here? Are you looking at revenue, ticket sales? Is that how you qualify a movie as good or bad? Well, for me, it all comes down to whether I like the movie. And there's been some really horrible movies that I've enjoyed that maybe only 10 other people in the world have enjoyed. But for me, that's all that matters. And if you like Linux, then what's it matter if like everybody likes it too? I mean, sure, it might feel great if the majority feels like you do, but we don't need the majority in order to justify what we like. So the year of the Linux desktop is just a silly concept altogether, and I just don't really feel like this is something that we should fixate on. I think we should let Linux exist in its natural environment exactly as it's intended to exist and let it naturally gravitate into whatever sector it wants to be in. And I know I'm kind of making it out to be like Linux is an entity that can think, but I do feel that technology, when it's invented, is a natural fit in some situations, maybe not a natural fit in others. And in this case, I don't feel like it's an issue at all where Linux doesn't fit in with laptops and desktops. I think it absolutely does, and it's a great choice. But again, Windows got there first. It's as simple as that. That's why it's number one. There's no other reason. That's all there is to it. People hate change. They prefer the status quo. And unless human nature changes, then, well, Linux has no chance to become the dominant desktop operating system because, well, people. Now, the thing is, can Linux take over computing? Well, sure, it absolutely can. But it's only going to happen when desktops die off. I mean, I feel like eventually desktops really won't exist. Now, we're talking a very long time from now. And I also need to clarify that I don't feel like desktops are going to die off for PC gamers because let's face it, I understand you guys love building gaming rigs. It's the greatest thing for you, and I love it too. It's a lot of fun. I totally get it. I don't think that's ever going to die. I don't think you'll ever see a situation where you can't buy one of those, a ginormous GPU and a really big PC case that looks really cool. I don't think that's going away. I'm talking about general computers, like your average person, people that don't care about gaming and don't care about computers at all. For those people, I think desktops will absolutely die and we'll be left with, gaming desktops for the people that want that kind of thing. But portable devices will be the dominant. And in some cases, it might already be the case. I haven't looked at the numbers. But as desktops die off, then that's no longer something we care about. There's no more Year of the Linux desktop because there's barely even desktops at that point. Then what do? Do we change it to Year of the Linux laptop? Is that what we're going to call it now? I mean, the same thing applies there too. Windows got there first. So we can make an argument, and only Chromebooks at this point have even made a dent in that. And that's Linux based. So we could actually count that as Linux dominating portables, which might actually mean that the year of the Linux laptop might happen. But in my opinion, let's just let the whole concept of year of the Linux desktop die off like it needs to and stop talking about it because it's quite possibly, in my opinion, one of the most irrelevant things to talk about nowadays. But you know what? I guess people like to blog about this and talk about it, and that's fine if you're into that kind of thing, but I would rather focus on something that is, well, a little bit more sound, a little bit more important to computing than just arguing over adoption numbers. And even if the numbers did matter, and year of the Linux desktop was actually an important thing to talk about, it's actually impossible to quantify. And some of the numbers that some people use when they debate this kind of makes me laugh a little bit. For example, they'll use the number that Steam shows as the number of people that are on Steam with Linux, even though that is the most unreliable number we can go with. And I really would hope that people stop using that as an example because that survey doesn't even show up for everybody. I mean, for me, I've been using Steam on Linux for as long as Steam existed for Linux. I have never once seen that particular survey come up. So whatever number we have nowadays of adoption in terms of Steam installs on Linux, that number doesn't count me. I mean, I have like 3 or 4 computers in here that all have Steam installed on them. Not one has seen the surveys, so none of those are being counted. So if no device in my home right now is counted towards the total number of installations for Steam on Linux, then how can we even trust that number? I mean, how much do we actually know about the algorithm or whatever they're using to produce those results? Are they counting you even if you opt out of that survey? And if they are, wouldn't that kind of go against privacy that they're counting you when you didn't even ask to be counted? And if we had the option to not be counted, a lot of people would absolutely choose that option because they don't want people to know too much. They don't think that there's a right to know when it comes to these companies. And I understand that. But all these things considered, we have to also keep in mind it's impossible to quantify how many Linux installations out there. The most reliable metric that we have that I'm aware of is how many web browsers out there are using Linux as the user agent. When you look at the metrics and statistics for popular websites, that'll get you closer to the actual number. But then again, considering there's a number of people out there that actually change the user agent, we do this a lot really when we have a website that says we only support Windows, even though there's no reason for that website to care because it's just HTML anyway, then we'll trick the user agent by saying, yeah, we're running on Windows 7 or Windows 10 or whatever, and trick the website into loading anyway. And then those people aren't being counted either. So the numbers are technically really hard to quantify, if not impossible. So anyway, the year of the Linux desktop, it's just not going to happen, and that's fine. Linux is still really cool, even if it's not the dominant distribution or dominant operating system out there. That's totally fine. Linux doesn't care if it's number one or not. Linux is just going to do what Linux does. The technology exists as it was developed to exist. People will either use it or they won't. People that do use it will either like it or they won't like it, depending on the individual, and that's fine. So I know that some of my opinions in this video might get you guys a little riled up, and I'm really not intending to do that. I mean, I'm just calling it like I've seen it over the past 2 decades, and I'm just not the kind of person to obsess over the analysts that go into, deep dive detail as far as why this isn't the case, when none of the things that they say are even relevant anyway, because, like I mentioned, it's just down to personal choice. And people don't like change, and it's that simple. So what I want to see is that we stop obsessing over the year of the Linux desktop, that we just let that go, enjoy Linux for what it is, and don't expect it to be something that it's not. And for you in particular, if you're on the fence whether you should try Linux or not, just try it. Don't worry about the numbers, your friend's opinion, the opinion of your Windows-specific blog site that you read every day. Don't worry about any of that. Just try it out for yourself. Come to your own opinion. And I feel like that's true in everything. I mean, nowadays we're so obsessed with reviews, where things get review bombed, and good movies that, got review bombed, people won't watch when it could have been a good movie anyway. Same with music, video games. We're so obsessed with other people's opinion on things that it's like we can't even make our own mind up about what we should like. And that's a trend that I want to see go away across the board. We need to come up with our own opinion and come to our own conclusion and not worry about what other people think. So definitely check out Linux if you haven't already done so. Check out a distribution or 2 or 3 or 10. Have some fun with it, and let's stop taking it so seriously. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. Let me know your comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video.